Hello strongmen. If you're feeling overwhelmed, stressed and stuck, you're not alone. At The Strongmen, we understand the relentless stress and pressure, but recognise that mastering challenges plays a key role in becoming a better version of ourselves. TSM is a growing community whose purpose is to redefine the strongman and empower men like you to transform stress into strength. I'm Chris Stone, your host, and together we'll develop physical mastery, mental toughness and collective strength to forge a life marked by calmness, confidence and control. Hello and welcome back to the Strongmen podcast with me, Chris, your very bunged up host. I do not feel particularly well today, but we move, as they say, we move. Because shit needs done and I'm self-employed. Yay! You self-employed people out there will understand what this is like, where you feel like, I need to do stuff, because if I don't do stuff, then stuff's going to mount up and then I'm never going to get through all the stuff. But yes, anyway, welcome to the Strongmen podcast. I am very happy that you are here today. If you are a regular listener, thank you so much for your support. And if you're new here, you're very welcome. And thank you for checking it out. Today, I'm very grateful that this episode brings back the guest interview. Now, if you are new to this podcast, the first series of the podcast, we were interviewing guys, just hearing a little about their stories, their experiences and insights. Thus far in series 2, it's just been myself. I've been chatting through the Strongmen, some of the founding principles of the Strongmen, and that means we haven't had a guest interview. But that changes today, because today we are chatting with Dan Osman, who is a well-being coach and someone who's quite well known in the fitness industry generally. I've seen him chat before in conferences and I've really liked what he's had to say. So I was very happy to get him on the podcast today to share a little bit about his own knowledge, insight, story, etc. So we'll be getting to that in a minute. But before that, I wanted just to chat to you a little bit about what's been happening since the last episode with the Strongmen. So as I've been talking about, the Strongmen 6-week program has been going really well, or it had been going really well. It's now finished. Very sadly, I'm absolutely gutted it's done because I was loving it. It was a lot of fun. And actually not having the weekly sessions last week was very sad. I missed it. I really did. But fear not, because the Strongmen I'll get to that. I'll get to it. But to recap, the final week of the Strongmen program, we were doing some strength testing where we were assessing the guy's strength across 4 different lifts: deadlift, squat, pendlay row and bench press. They were then basically evaluating their progress over the 6 weeks. We did a test at the start of the program and now at the end, and amazingly all of the guys managed to set new PBs across all the lifts, which is just awesome. I was so delighted for them, and that session was undoubtedly my favourite session of the entire 6 weeks. It was so much fun, very motivating to be there and to be a part of it. And then we went on to have our post-program socials. So we went down to Fairplay and did this sort of fairground style games that we all sucked at, and we didn't win any prizes, which was a disappointment. But then at the same time, you know, the odds are stacked against you with these sort of fairground games, aren't they? So we'll go a bit easy on ourselves for that. And then it was off to Down the Hatch after that, which just basically a restaurant to get some good food and a few drinks in as well. It was amazing. Really had such a nice time, and the guys very much enjoyed themselves too. As you can tell, I think, or you... Even now when I'm trying to do words, it's just not working. Because I don't feel very well, my English is poor at the best of times. But I feel like I'm just stuttering and stammering and getting my words in the wrong order today. So please do forgive me. Anyway, where were we? So yes, the Strongmen 6-week program is very sadly finished. And I will be sharing some feedback from the guys in the program on this very podcast. just not this episode. It'll likely be the next episode or the one after that. So you get a flavour of what's involved. Going forward, this program is going to actually serve as a fast track for those who want to try out the strongmen in the short term and quickly level up their skills. It's also going to feed in very nicely to the strongmen memberships, and this is what I want to talk about next. This is a brand new tiered membership system for the strongmen that I'm going to be using going forward. There are 4 different memberships for you to choose from: the Essential, Core, Mastery and Tailored memberships. I'm not going to spend any time at all really going through what each one of them is, because time is precious and I want to stop talking as quickly as I possibly can today. So if you want to know a little bit more about this membership system, check out the episode description. You'll find a link there to an information pack which will give you all the details that you'll need to know. There is one more thing I wanted to talk about in terms of the strongmen before we move on, and that is the Mind Muscle Mastery workshop. So this is a workshop that is open to anyone. You don't have to be a member of the strongmen to come along. It's on Sunday, the 17th of March, 12 to 1:30 at Engage Sport and Fitness Centre. Tickets cost $27.79. It's a great opportunity for you to come and see what the strongmen are all about, learn some new skills and tools that you can use in your own training, and start to build some serious strength and resilience. You can sign up via the Eventbrite link that once again you can find in the episode description. If you want to know a little bit more information about either the Strongmen memberships or the workshop, don't hesitate to get in touch with me. It's tsm@thewellbeingpt.com. TSM, as in standing for The Strong Men, tsm@thewellbeingpt.com. Sorry if that was a bit patronising, but I just wanted to make sure I was clear. Moving swiftly on then to the check-in and lighter fuel. This is the part of the show designed to help you check in, settle in, and also engage in some self-reflection before we get into the main part of the episode. In the final week of the 6-week program, we spend some time looking at self-determination theory, just to set the guys up for continued success beyond the 6 weeks. This theory is a leading theory that helps to explain human motivation and behavioural change, and it suggests that we need to fulfill 3 basic psychological needs in order to have this level of self-determination and control. These 3 needs are autonomy, competency and relatedness. When I consider the Strongmen program and also the Strongmen more generally, there's no doubt it ticks all of these boxes: autonomy, competency and relatedness, which for me explains why the guys have made such incredible progress over the past 6 weeks and will continue to do so as they continue on with the strongmen. It's very clear that they have a level of control over their decision making, and they also have a high level of motivation at the moment as well. Once again, because we're ticking these boxes: autonomy, competency, relatedness. Now I want to ask you the question: how much do you feel in control of your own life and decisions? You can use a 1 to 10 scale to kind of gauge this. So 1 is not in control at all, and 10 is fully in control. So take a minute, just reflect on your life generally. I'm not just talking about health and fitness, just generally, where would you fall on that 1 to 10 scale at the moment? The lighter fuel question, just to help stimulate thoughts even further, is: if you feel this lack of control, how much of it is related to autonomy, competency, or relatedness? So autonomy, making your own choices and your own decisions. Competency is having a level of skill and feeling capable, and relatedness is having connections with others. Is there any psychological need that you're not meeting there? And if so, what might you need to change? And with that, I am done talking for now, which is great. I'm going to go get another lime sip in the meantime, even though I hate lemon. Oh, it's disgusting, but needs must. Enjoy the interview with Dan Osman. I know you're going to get a lot from it. He is incredibly knowledgeable. He's been in the health and fitness industry for far longer than I have. As I say, I've seen him talk before and really loved what he had to say, and I loved what he had to say also in our interview. He gave me a lot of food for thought. and highlight a number of really important points that will no doubt serve you well in terms of improving your own health and fitness. So, without further ado, let's get into the interview with Dan Osman. Today, we are bringing back the guest interview part of the podcast, and I'm delighted to welcome Dan Osman to the podcast today. So, hi, Dan. I was hoping you could begin by just introducing yourself a little bit. So, over to you.
The worst part about me, my least favourite subject. I suppose in a nutshell, I describe myself as more like a health mongrel these days, because I've been through various different incarnations of the profession of a health professional over the years. So that originally started as like a regular, I guess, level 2 health and fitness instructor, wiping sweat off machines, wanted to specialise in S&C, ran that alongside doing some PT work for the university I worked at, moved into my own kind of consultancy stuff, did a postgrad in nutrition, worked with Gen Pop, worked with athletic athletes, worked with boxing athletes, netball athletes. I've just been in such a mix mash of things. Now I still coach one-to-one. I do some wellbeing talks. I do some public speaking events. I have my own podcast. I do a bit of everything, really. So I'm proudly more of a generalist these days than a specialist, I would say.
So over the years, then, I think you described yourself there as a health mongrel, which is a very descriptive way of putting it. You've obviously kind of gathered a lot of experiences over the years in the fitness industry. I'm just a little bit interested to know, like, can you kind of give us a bit of a journey through those different phases? Like you said, you started as a sort of level 2 and then kind of worked your way through. Yeah, can you share a little bit about the journey and some of those kind of key experiences that you learned along the way?
Absolutely. So health-seeking behaviour for me wasn't really high up on a priority list as a teenager. So I was in a much larger body as a teenager. Exercise, I enjoyed sports like most people, but I wasn't necessarily gifted in anything. As you do in secondary school, if you are aware of the shape of your body, other people soon make you aware of that as well. So I probably withdrew a little bit. I was the kid that always had an excuse not to do the PE session, always had a note from his mum. I found great comfort in eating. There was some personal turmoil going on in my life around that time. So this amalgamated into being not a very active individual. Coming from culturally a Mediterranean background is we're very good at eating anyway. So that encompassed with finding comfort in eating. It led me to a place I probably wasn't all that happy or comfortable in or confident in. I had self-esteem issues around self-worth. I think, like most people, just struggling to find my way in the world as a teenager. And I think arguably that probably took me to my late 20s when I kind of did some more introspective work. I understood that things needed to change for me. So at that moment in time, the latter part of my teens, I kind of ostracized myself from a lot of the groups I was in, not necessarily going down the wrong path, but definitely a path that wouldn't serve me towards the future I wanted for myself. And I didn't actually know what that future was, but I just knew it had to be distinctly different to what I was experiencing at that time. So I took a vested interest in health and fitness. I think for most people, it was morely and primarily on an aesthetics base to begin with. I want to better myself and how I feel about myself based on losing a bit of body weight. So I joined a gym. It was a hardcore bodybuilder gym. I hid out in the upstairs room, which was then called the ladies' suite. It's kind of your hardcore bodybuilders downstairs, grunting and groaning, being really intimidating. And you had fixed weight resistance machines upstairs and did a bit of everything. I took up running, like most people as well, looking to increase their fitness. Didn't really understand the facets involved in that and that it didn't have to be running despite hating it. But I used to clock up a lot of miles on the road, a lot of cycling and lifting. And when I went to university, I knew I had to kind of take a vested interest in what I wanted to specialise in, or at least what I was interested in to get me through uni, to get kind of the marks and to the level I had aspirations of reaching. So with that, there was a heavily discounted level 2. There was a level 2, then a level 3 health and fitness qualification at that time. And that was, I got a job at the gym. That was health MOTs for people, taking their blood pressure, doing the regular bioelectrical impedance, showing them around bits of kit. And yeah, just experience into working with the regular person, I guess, the person that wasn't that interested in exercise, trying to share some of what had inspired me with them, to them wanting to do my level 3, did some personal training alongside doing my uni qualification just for a bit of pocket money. Anyone that's a student, especially now these days, will know that you are skint all of the time. I think my weekly spend on shopping was 25 quid a week at that time, which would probably get you a piece of broccoli and a dozen eggs these days. So yeah, scraped through with that. I knew I had a vested interest in martial arts and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in particular, and became really keenly invested in performance sports. And, there was a couple of, I think, athletes at the time. Silvio Simac springs to mind. He kind of had the physique that I aspired to have, but he was also a really proficient martial artist. So once I'd lost a considerable amount of weight, I soon found it was a bit of a baptism into rolling with a bit of rough and tumble with the larger athletes, whether that was adipose tissue or muscular, that I needed to keep up a little bit. So I did some voluntary work for the uni. I was doing my PT at the time, and they had an S&C suite there. We had Saracens Rugby Club next door to us, and they were running part of the TAS scheme, Talented Athlete and Scholarship Scheme. That still runs over here, I believe, which have basically students in higher education have a certain amount of funding allocated for strength conditioning, physiotherapy, lifestyle support, and that kind of thing. So we had such a range of athletes coming through the door with the voluntary work I did. We had archers, we had equestrian sports, we had divers, we had netball athletes, we had Arsenal ladies down the road. So a real mix mash. I did some voluntary work with the English Institute of Sport at that time as well. Some good advice I got in my early days was just that, essentially marks and grades get you to a certain place, but you also need a wealth of experience. So I wanted to get as much of that in as possible, as well as just selfishly, just for my own knowledge base and how to make my own training better. And it was a bit of a baptism into what was working with general population and people that weren't that motivated, that it was the hardest part of the day for all the right reasons and the challenges that we understand that people experience now, to the very adherent, compliant athlete. Do this for this result. And I think for me, on reflection, in terms of communication and developing some sort of empathy and emotional intelligence with the people that I work with, that taught me quite a lot. Because what motivates one person or one group of people doesn't distinctly motivate another. I originally planned to do this isn't very brief at all, by the way, is it?
That's okay. I was really interested, so keep it going. Keep it going.
I originally planned to do my Masters by Research. I had a coaching module, which was on the efficacy of coaching, like coaches' confidence, how that translates into how they work with their athletes. That's what I wanted to do my Masters on at the time. An opportunity at Saracens Rugby Club came up. They were advertising S&C internship. So I applied for that. I got that. It was just a bit too much to manage. I was still renting a flat with my now wife then. When we was in university, we both stayed on. Just anyone that's done an internship, they don't pay you anything. So it was quite long days, which I was grateful for the experience, but there was a realistic factor that also I had to live. So it was working there all day, working at the gym as well, doing still health and fitness shifts. So you have late shifts and you've always got someone still lifting weights at 10 o'clock at night. Anyone that's worked in a gym will attest to that. And yeah, that was essentially glorified water boy, but I learned a lot. GPS tracking. I was doing osmolality testing for the athletes at the time. They took great pleasure in pissing on the bottles because they knew how to test their urine. And it was, again, that was another baptism. I grew rhino skin that year, with the banter that most people that work in rugby will be exposed to. Obviously, an insight into professional sport, insight into communicating with athletes, why things were programmed. I think coming through a more academic route, I was very much grounded in, you do this because it translates into your sport. So small things like the fact that the S&C coaches had programmed arms on a Friday for the athletes really had me scratching my head. But actually, once I come to understand that, having some investment from the athletes about doing things that just make them feel good. They don't necessarily need any sport-specific transfer. It's just they like doing guns of a weekend, and that's enough. That makes them compliant with other aspects. So lots of lessons in there. Carried on working at the university with the TAS athletes in the strength and condition role, got an employed job as PT, and I was doing the TAS work. I had to drop the internship at a later date just from an affordability point of view because I couldn't afford to do it, allocate the majority of my day to working voluntarily for the athletes as much as I enjoyed it, and carried on there for a couple of years. My wife and I relocated back to Essex, where we both grew up, starting PT from scratch and proving that I had to pay a mortgage. I got a job with a school, working in a school sports partnership as a sports development officer, which was essentially part of curating and involving all the local primary feeder schools and secondary schools in competition as much as possible. So, yeah, I had experience going from 5-year-olds to like 50 plus year olds, probably older than that actually, from taking into consideration PT clients, to developing that into a position where I dropped the school role just because I was working 70 hours a week, schools all day, PT all evening, 7 days a week, and somehow evolved into what I do now. Believe it or not, that's the short version.
No, I mean, it's super interesting, and I can see just how that journey would be really valuable. And as you say, allowing you to work with such a broad range of people and develop skills, and that understanding of, I need to take different approaches with the kind of person that I'm working with. So on the note of health and fitness industry, I want to stay here for now and kind of ask a couple of questions. So the first question I have is, what do you believe to be the biggest issues and barriers that persist in the fitness industry right now, particularly in the context of men and their health and fitness?
I think specifically to do with men, I say specifically, I think it is more broader than that. I think we're still very much aesthetics driven, and that a lot of the messaging and the narrative relies on the basis that you have to look a certain way. And because of that, there is this barrier to entry that if you don't fit a certain body type or body ideal, so if you, speaking from a male perspective, if you aren't lean or you aren't muscular to a certain degree, then you have no place in this space. Whereas I think health and fitness is accessible to all and should be accessible to all, but we paint it as quite an elitist picture. It's obviously not as transparent as it could be, and I think there's many perhaps misselling the dream of what health and fitness looks like still, knowingly as well. I think that my biggest issue is knowingly. There's very much a difference, I think, between, and I can certainly reflect on my own journey with this, is knowing better and doing better. There's plenty of things I think I can reflect on which I now don't agree with, practices, things, ways that I program, nutritional advice that I've given, my views and opinions on certain things, that I can comfortably say, I've changed on that, but that was the best me at that time. I know through having private conversations with other peers and industry authorities, in air quotations for the sake of the listeners, and leaders, they know better and choose not to do better because they know they can also capitalize on a more vulnerable and desperate audience. That is one of my biggest, I guess, grievances at this time, is that I think collectively we have the ability to do better, but because we live in a capitalist world, I'm not averse to capitalism and people making money. We've all got bills to pay. But I think when we prioritize making money out of people and preying on their vulnerabilities and insecurities above their actual health and their well-being, and primarily them, they are the focus. They're not on our journey as coaches or to make a certain amount of money. We're on their journey. We're there to provide a service. And I think much is productized delivery, which is essentially a version of cookie cutting, classed as coaching, but isn't actually coaching because it's not person-centered. It's not taking that individual, the challenges they experience, their training history, their history of injuries, all these other things into consideration. It is very much, this is my approach, this is very easily repeatable. I can sell it for this amount. I can get a low barrier to entry, get as many people on as possible. And sure, it will work in the short term, and that's arguably what a lot of people want. I'm not necessarily suggesting we give people what they don't need, but I think that stems from an issue around the narrative and the story that we tell people, is that it's still largely, you have to look a certain way before you get access to these things or before you can be healthy and happy. And that's just simply not the case.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for sharing that insight. It's really helpful. And like even personally, and as someone who works in the fitness industry, I still feel that pressure from the aesthetics point of view to look a certain way. And I do feel like sometimes, I'm not a huge guy by any means, so I feel sometimes a little bit insecure and inadequate almost just because of the way I look. If that's how I feel, and how do many of the people who access the gym and want to improve their health and well-being, and like how do they feel? So that's a really huge barrier. So yeah, thanks for highlighting those key points. I do, however, I don't want to always focus on the negative things, because there obviously are some really, really positive, lots of really positive things in the health and fitness industry. So I'm going to flip it now and ask you, what do you think are the best things about the health and fitness industry currently?
The best thing is we are still very much in our infancy, and it's a learning curve for all of us. But also with that, there is given the time that the industry, I guess, has existed, and beyond just aesthetics, is there is such a wealth of expertise, a plethora of experience out there, and people that are now speaking about different things. So perhaps 10, 15 years ago, there was only really one or two voices in the industry that had I guess, their message understood. It was very elitist, very much a false dichotomy of sorts. Is like, it's this way, it's the right way, or this is the wrong way, should do, shouldn't do's. Whereas there's much more discussion around the nuance, much more discussion around the factors and the facets that are involved in people making the right decisions based on them as well. Much more talk about comparison, much more talk about genetics and all these other factors that influence how ultimately people want to live better. And I think that's more discussed at the moment, is like living a fuller life rather than a life that requires you to cut out more from it, or the fact that you have to sacrifice in some shape or form. There's much more discussion around compromises, and there's much more, I think, pragmatic advice out there. But also, the other great thing about the industry at the moment is because we are going through this evolution, and people that have been coaching for a certain number of years or have been leading their business in a certain number of years, is there's much more transparent discussion around coaching practices. But I think, like most things, there's almost like an overcorrective pendulum swing. So when I did my level 3 PT, there was absolutely no discussion around business acumen, marketing, how to do your taxes, let alone how you adjust certain movements for people with certain restrictions, or limb lengths, or biomechanics, and all these kind of things. It was essentially just a job of exchanging time for money. And I think with the business advice that's coming through now, there are unfortunately, some con artists, and I think that's where the pendulum swing comes on, is primarily making money, and business has become the focal point, whereas we're almost neglecting the coaching skills and just the basic human skills. I don't even see them as coaching competencies. We're talking about just emotional intelligence, the ability to listen, the ability to speak to someone on their terms and make what you're saying make sense to them, rather than trying to impress your peers with overcomplicated captions or uses of anatomical phrases. So there, yeah, for much of the some of the negatives, there's a bunch of positives, and we've got some really not only cool people at the top, knowledgeable, experienced, etc., but some really, and I don't want to sound like an old man by saying this, or to sound condescending to anyone in any shape or form, but I think because of the exposure to this, there is such a thirst for knowledge of people getting into the industry of, okay, I recognize like calorie deficit, these are some nutritional strategies, etc., etc. But how do I get to the motivation of this individual? How do I get them to be more compliant and adherent based on their terms? How can we navigate these changes in life together? It's come through an evolution, and I like most things, it is normally in the grey. It isn't one or the other. But yeah, that's, I think, where, amongst many other things, I'm sure there's other things, but as you say, I'm not going to dwell on the negatives.
No, thanks for that. Yeah, I in my own experience could totally relate to that idea as well. I went into I started PTing in 2016, I think it was, and at that, in the early stages, it was very much like show up, get the one-to-one PT session done. That was it for the week, basically. And then, if I'm honest, it wasn't really coaching as such. It was more just like instructing. You're here for this. That was all it was, really. I kind of had that mindset of like, yeah, everything was very surface level, actually, like in terms of I've got this knowledge about physical training and nutrition. Like, here's the knowledge. You take that and you take my knowledge, and now you're going to achieve your goals but without actually understanding that, no, I need to go far deeper than that. And it was just in time, just actually by being exposed to clients' challenges and fears and struggles, like they just opened up and started talking, that I realized like I'm missing something here. Those conversations used to piss me off because I'm like, oh, I've only got 15 minutes to get through this session and you're busy telling me about your relationship struggles or your challenges at work. And then in time, I began to realize there's so much value in those conversations and I'm not paying any regard to them at all. And yeah, that kind of opened my eyes to like, yeah, I need to go far deeper here. And it's good to see that, as you say, there's a lot more openness around coaching practices and coaches generally are, maybe not all of us, but there's more accessibility to tools. And I remember going to, in fact, a conference that you were at. It was really the first conference that I'd been at where we had presentations around like not only client well-being, but there was a presentation on the compassionate coach. So like, how can you cultivate compassion towards yourself as well as your clients? And that was like, oh, this is, for me, I was like, this is brilliant. It's so good to see this kind of stuff in the fitness industry. And as you say, in the earlier years, that sort of stuff probably wouldn't have even been touched on. It would have been seen as a little bit, I don't know. Well, I can't talk from experience. I've not been in the industry that long, but relatively. But I can imagine the early years in particular, there was no kind of chat around those concepts.
You spent an hour learning a squat or something like that. Every workshop you went to, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, moving on. So still keeping it on the topic of health and fitness and that sort of thing. The podcast, the main goal is that we're trying to develop both strength and resilience. And when we consider strength and resilience, we're not just thinking about it as solely physical or solely mental. These are terms that encompass both. So we're developing that strength and resilience both physically and mentally to help us improve our performance professionally, personally, and also live sort of more fulfilled, happy lives. So just thinking about training as a whole, reflecting on your years of coaching and your experience, what recommendations would you provide for trying to enhance your strength and resilience?
I think initially the understanding of resilience has to stem from, although it may be intimidating, this thing I need to prove to myself I can do it. I need to prove I can endure it. And I think that's where resilience is built. We have to experience adversity, whether that's mental or physical or wherever it may be. And certainly I can think of things I would wish on my worst enemies that many people have been through. But it's only once you've proved to yourself you have the ability to endure that, is that you cultivate this sense of resilience, I think. So there is no easy route. And I think what we do in the industry and much of the messaging surrounds is being ready. And the truth of it is no one is ever ready. We have this fear of the fear. It's not even a fear of failure, because what I've been speaking about quite often to clients and things at the moment is this safe unhappiness. These parameters that I'm in at the moment, I know are miserable, but I'm safe in that because I understand the trajectory. I can endure that. I know I can endure that. And when it comes to stepping outside your comfort zone, it's almost we're stepping into unsafe unhappiness, because there's so many more questions around what that failure actually means, because we don't know. We catastrophize the future and we think of the worst possible outcome. We don't think about what could be the best outcome of that. So I think on the readiness point is we don't necessarily need to wait until we're ready. We just have to be willing. And sometimes that comes from trying and being willing to try something new. And I think there's a lot of reservations around that, because there are many instances. I know if I do this thing, okay, it's not ideal, but I know the result of that. If I try something new, well, what if it's way worse? And people find great difficulty getting their head around that. So in terms of cultivating and developing that sense of resilience, it's being willing, I think, initially to try something new, try a different approach, try a different mentor, try a different environment, even whatever it may be. But don't wait until you're ready, because no one is ever ready. Readiness rarely shows its face.
No, that's brilliant. That's really good insight, and something that will be really helpful, because I've, and I'm sure you've experienced this objection a few times in potentially working with or having a consultation with a potential new client and that sort of thing. And there's almost that it's like resistance is, well, let me just get this in place first, and then once that's in place, we're good to go. So yeah, it's something that does come up quite often. So it's a good reminder to accept that.
I think a perfect example of it that I can think of off the top of my head is that we have this unsafe happiness in people that are perpetual dieters, in that whatever it may be, keto, low carb, whatever it is, whatever approach they've taken, they understand the premise, okay, calorie deficit, let's break it down into the most simple terms. And they know they can be adherent for whether it's 3 weeks, it's 6 weeks, 12 weeks, whatever it may be, because they have a clear understanding of the trajectory of that. If I stick to that for 12 weeks, that's going to get me there. And then once I'm there, then perhaps I can address my relationship with food, rather than having the insight and the introspection to go, actually, that's not sticking around. That clearly doesn't work for me. Maybe it's time to step away from the fast fat loss or this dietary approach. Maybe I need to explore something different. And sure, that comes with fear. You know, I work with people in their relationship with food, and it's maybe you need to step away from fat loss. Maybe we actually need to get to the understand what relationship with food means to you. What are the barriers coming up? Can we address some of those things, some of those habitual things, some of that behavior change? Then that might lend itself to fat loss further down the line. But by primarily focusing on the outcome all of the time, is you're missing on the internal work. You know, and I think it's been bastardized a little bit. That's essentially what mindset is. You know, it's your thinking patterns, your beliefs around yourself. And thanks to the wonders of neuroplasticity, is we can change that, but it takes time. And when everything's condensed into achieve this in 12 weeks, achieve this in 8 weeks, we're living in an era of Amazon Prime, you know, one click and it's there the next day. People want results as quick as possible. I understand that. But if you're in this perpetual cycle of finding yourself in an unhappy place, doing the same things time and time again, because that isn't sticking, it's time to reevaluate.
Yeah, you're speaking my language, absolutely. One client in particular that springs to mind, where the focus for years had been on fat loss, fat loss, fat loss. Like the whole life almost revolved around this goal of achieving fat loss. And it was only in time that we began to try and move away from that being the outcome. And instead, let's focus on just trying to enjoy or exercise a little bit more, or increase strength. Let's increase our levels of strength. And then sort of inadvertently, as a result of changing that focus over time and being consistent and enjoying your training more and building strength, what happened? They began to lose the body fat, which was the outcome they actually wanted in the first place. But yeah, as you say, it takes time, and often moving away from fixating on that outcome, which probably hasn't served you well in the past and still isn't serving you well, can be the key. Absolutely.
But they know they can endure that side of it. They know that our worst case scenario, I can revert back to what I did before to get me to that place. Whereas the prospect of trying something new, especially when it comes to people and their bodies and how they feel about themselves, is, you know, what if I put on weight? You know, what if the effects and the results aren't as immediate as they were? Like, can I be bothered? Not only can, you know, is it going to be hard, but can I be bothered? Like, I know if I go low carb for 6 weeks before I go to Marbella, I'm going to lose a bit of weight. You know, that's easier than putting in the graft sometimes. And I don't mean that in an elitist sense, but anything that's worth having, and that's not just on an aesthetics front, that's on the mental health side of things, the introspective work, the journaling, the meditation, yoga practice, whatever it may be, it takes the reps and it takes time. And that's a difficult sell. That's a difficult sell when there's so much promised to people that if you invest in this is the guaranteed outcome. And we're almost too outcome focused rather than the process driven, I think.
For sure, yeah. Well, thanks for sharing all of that. Again, I'm sure that's been incredibly valuable for all that are listening. We'll move on, and I want to widen the conversation a little bit now, and we're going to consider. Well, we'll focus more on men and masculinity. So, I wanted to ask you firstly a little bit about your sort of mini series, which is Man Baggage. So, could you just tell us a little bit about that whole concept?
It was born out of the idea, I say born out of the idea, is I haven't always been the most open and communicative man. I guess I was very much of the mindset that muscularity was masculinity to a certain degree. I bought into a lot of the stereotypical, archaic masculine stereotypes of having to be a certain way to portray myself as a man, like the certain power dynamic in certain groups. And you had to be aggressive all of the time, and actually to be a bit emotionally intelligent, to be a bit empathetic, to be actually, I'm a deeply sensitive person, is effeminate in some way, and almost withdrawing and hiding those aspects of myself from people, to doing a lot of work over the years, quite honestly. Again, this isn't an overnight thing. I've done a bunch of therapy. I've done lots of introspective work. I've been through bouts of awful parts of my life to, in the latter part of my 30s, being more comfortable in masculinity is a version of what you define. And actually, what is very helpful to other men is to hear collectively discussions around different experiences, because there isn't a set way to be a man. It comes in different shapes, sizes, thought patterns, backgrounds, ethnicities, cultures, etc. And the Man Baggage series was essentially to give airtime to as many men as possible, which you're kind enough to give up some of your time for, publicly and live. I thought initially would be a nice opportunity to do it. It's not curated, it's not premeditated, there's no rigid structure in terms of questioning. It's just, as a group of blokes, let's have an open conversation about our experiences, our thoughts, our opinions on what it is to be a man, and also some of the struggles, because it is a bit of a weird time to be a man. And I don't mean that from a get the world smile with his violin out, or a whataboutism in terms of it's any more than women have experienced over this length of time. But I think when younger men especially are looking to characters that do typically fit into that archetypal Andrew Tate, Donald Trump, overtly misogynist or sexist, or geezers, lads, I've got to go out on the piss, I've got to get into fights. It probably is helpful for them to have other, I'm certainly not referring to myself in this, but other role models that they can listen to and observe objectively, especially men that I guess would be closer to masculine ideals, at least perceptively from a distance, from afar. So I don't know whether most people would understand me to be a deeply sensitive person just by looking at me. But giving public platforms is I get the opportunity to share some of my experiences, which doesn't make them definitive or everyone else's experiences, but at least giving the opportunity for other men to have these conversations, as tiny as my platform is, I think would be helpful to other boys and men coming into age and trying to find their place in the world.
Yeah, 100%. And there's so much power behind the story as well. So I encourage a lot of guys. I mean, this is what the podcast is all about: is to get other men on to talk a little bit and share the stories and give different viewpoints and insights and sharing of experiences. I wanted to touch on this idea of sort of what we might define as like sort of high traditional masculinity, because for me also that was where I was for such a long time, especially kind of late teens, early 20s, and that sort of age range. And that idea of masculinity had such a detrimental impact on my own mental health and physical health as well. So I was wondering if you could share a little bit, if you were happy to share a little bit about how that idea of masculinity impacted you.
I think culture had a big impact on it, and that all my family in Northern Cypriot, and this isn't a slight on the culture at all, but very much gender normative roles, in that women took care of the house, they cooked, they cleaned. Essentially, men did as they pleased. Still within that culture, there is a high instance, and Islamic cultures in general, of femicide, women mistreated. I was witness to that, I guess, not necessarily from my parents weren't in an arranged marriage, but it was an introductory of sorts. So neither one of them, well, especially on my mother's side, had insight into the dynamics of how culturally, like over in Britain, dynamics should be, or more equal in terms, let's just say, and that they're pretty much things that men were always forgiven of. And I think that impacted me highly because it didn't resonate in any shape or form. I grew up in quite fearful of my place. There wasn't a lot of safety at home, and in some ways, I think where the archetype kind of masculine, dominant, aggressive, financial provider role, that didn't resonate with me. So I felt like there was some sort of inner failing there. And that caused me to explore that concept a little bit more, probably try to emulate it a little bit in my early years. And I think that's where a lot of my, I guess, physique aspirations came from, and this idea that muscularity is masculinity and that you had to be physically dominant and not necessarily to the opposite sex, but at least amongst other men, you had to prove your dominance, and you can't let certain people talk to you in a certain way. So maybe even my early 20s maybe had a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about having to emulate a version of myself. But I'm sure anyone will attest to, if you're constantly having to put a mask on and be a version of yourself that you simply aren't, that can be draining, and that led to detriments in my own mental health, and this impetus to explore that a little bit more and take some insight into actually what do I value. My mother predominantly brought me up. I probably do find communicating with women a little bit easier than men at times. I don't resonate with highly laddish culture or drinking beers, getting pissed, getting into fights, which I probably tried to do when I was a bit younger because I thought that's what I had to be. And it's only, I guess, when you come into your own, and for a lot of people that's trial and error, that you realise what being a man is to you. And a man is, to me, whatever you want to make it. And men don't have to be hard. They don't have to be emotionally withdrawn. They don't have to be aggressive. They can be all of those things. Of course they can. And there will be context-specific times and circumstances. With Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I have to be aggressive, but it's also controlled aggression. I'm not out of control. Emotional regulation has to come into that. Whereas I can reflect on periods where that aggression that I witnessed wasn't controlled, and that came out in less than helpful ways. And I think it certainly did for me when I was a bit younger as well. I grew up very scared, and as a result of that, angry in time, and almost trying to prove myself in some way that wasn't really necessary, and wasn't to prove to anyone else. In my mind, it had to be proved to other people, but no one else was expecting that from me. And I like to think, or I'm at least trying to be, I'm a highly flawed human. I will state that, but I do try to be the best husband, father, role model, professional, friend, significant other that I can be. And I do hold my hands up when I get things wrong. I am constantly learning. I'd rather be on the imposter syndrome, slightly insecure at times, questioning my own actions and behaviours side of things than the Dunning-Kruger, I know it all, I can't be questioned, which I still see a lot of men are.
Absolutely, kind of this fixed perception of what a man should be. And also, I guess that feeds into then the opposite of what you're saying, where you're able to hold your hands up and say, yeah, I get things wrong. There's still things about me that are flawed, or things that I want to work on. But when you have that fixed outlook of yourself and of what a man should be, it takes away that opportunity for growth.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there is some necessary humility in imposter syndrome. Like I understand the sentiment, but often when I hear about people talk about imposter syndrome, for example, is that it doesn't exist. No one should have imposter syndrome. This is how you rid yourself of it. I think it's a necessary part of humility. It keeps you grounded. I never want to feel like I'm superior to anyone. I never want to feel like I'm better than anyone. I'm certainly no less. I think the same on the other side of the spectrum. I don't think less of myself than anyone else, but I'm also open to the idea of learning things from people. There's something to be learned from everyone. I don't mean that in a cheesy sense. I truly believe that, which is why I like to have as many conversations with people as possible, because we're all limited in terms of empathy to our real world experiences through our lens. I can be empathetic to a certain degree, but if I haven't experienced something, I need to learn about that. Or if it's going to come up in my world. If you want to, there are certainly people that don't want to learn those things, but that's not me. I like to experience the world through the eyes of others sometimes, because they're possibly likely things I'd never experience.
Yeah. I think it unlikely that the kind of men that we're describing here, the ones who are quite fixed, would actually listen to a podcast like this. But if
No,
they
definitely
were
not.
to, but if they did happen to listen to this episode, for instance, and they're in that mindset, and actually there's a part of them that does want to maybe challenge this idea of masculinity, and they maybe feel a little uneasy about who they are to a degree, like they're butting up against who they are is butting up against this idea of masculinity. Where would you even encourage them to start?
I think exploring that inner discernment. I think, as you alluded to, there is that uncomfortable rumbling within. I think as you say, the overtly who would class themselves as, in air quotations, alphas won't listen to this, but those that possibly will experience some of that inner questioning of themselves. This doesn't resonate with me. Could I perhaps seek out others? Much like the man baggage series, that wasn't not necessarily directing everyone to that, but there are many more conversations around that. There are more public figures that you would typically define as highly masculine that are having more vulnerable conversations. So Terry Crews springs to mind. He's, I guess, to look at him, he is a very muscular, alpha dominant male, but has also had some tragedy, had some horrendous experiences through his life, and he's very broad and open about owning his bad experiences and things where he's perhaps not represented himself in a bit, like Alan Richardson. There are many more men publicly talking about this, because there's a lot of narrative around, well, where are the good role models out there? That's why kids are listening to Tay, etc. There are plenty. You just need to bloody look. Often the ones that get the most airtime or the most polarized, they're the ones speaking in absolute terms. They're the ones that rely on clickbait, that they rely on ad revenue, etc. It's often the bits in between, the entirely unsexy grey area, where is all the value for everyone on every topic. I think we don't live in a world of black and white absolutes, but that's what gets most eyes on.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because I think you also mentioned that lens and perspective that we all have, and I suppose that as well makes it even harder to see those other voices, because you're constantly looking through this lens, and it's kind of attracting these types of men as a result. So yeah, I think that's a good place to start for sure. We're going to wrap things up in a minute, and just in doing so, what I like to do is finish the interview with one final question. It's a question I always ask the guest at the end. So the question is, what one word would you use to describe a strong man, and why?
Off the top of my head, courage. The courage to be yourself, because being yourself is often the hardest thing in the world, but it should be the easiest thing in the world. So expressing yourself and exploring things that are of interest and things that resonate with you that maybe don't fit in those ideals or what you've typically believed to be a man to be. It takes courage to step away from the status quo. It takes courage to step away from environments, people, practices that don't align with you, because you do experience that inner turmoil. But that stems from being bold enough to step away from it and change something. So not necessarily courage in the overtly climb a mountain, lift weights, the dark, gloomy gyms and everything else that's portrayed on social media. It's the seemingly insignificant stuff, the micro adjustments, I think. But that stems with being bold enough and courageous enough to take that first step to be different and embrace it.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks so much. It's been really great to chat with you and hear a little bit about your story and your
Oh,
perspectives.
my pleasure.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thanks so much. Before I let you go, I just finish off by giving you a little bit of an opportunity to share a little bit about where people can find you. You mentioned also your podcast as well, so take a moment to share that information and plug yourself.
Yeah, I have no real agenda with plugging things. I certainly have nothing to sell directly to anyone. You can find me on most platforms. The.dan.osman on Instagram is where I put most of my content out. LinkedIn as well. I have my own podcast, as you mentioned, Dan Osman's Ramblings of a Madman. Very self-stigmatized, but if you can't poke fun at your own mental health, whose can you? It's pretty frowned upon to poke fun at someone else's. I have an email list as well, which I have neglected ever so slightly recently, but I try to put stuff out there. I write a blog. I try to do as much writing and speaking as possible because I read a lot, and I find reading is a great way to formalize your own opinions and thoughts on things by extrapolating different pieces of information, formalizing those and writing those down and conveying those to others helps me solidify not only my own knowledge, but my own understanding of things as well. So I certainly don't profess to teach anyone anything, but shared experience, I think, collectively um, keeps us all together. You know, that's what connects us is this weird human experience. And that comes from learning about other people's experiences.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Well, Dan, thanks so much. I've really, really enjoyed chatting with you. It's been a pleasure to have you on. And yeah, I just want to wish you all the best going forward.
Thanks, mate.
I don't know what else to say. It was brilliant. Really enjoyed chatting with Dan and having him on the podcast. Big shout out to him for taking some time to come and chat. I trust you really enjoyed the episode. If that is indeed the case, please do me one small favour. Drop a review on the podcast. Make sure it's 5 stars. If it's anything less than that, I will find you and I'll have some stern words with you, okay? 5 star or nothing. That's the rules. But yeah, appreciate it. Thanks very much. Not much more for me to say. I'm actually just going to sign off at this stage. Thanks very much for checking out the podcast. I'm really looking forward to bringing yet another guest interview to you next time round. You'll hear a little bit more as well from the guys who went through the 6-week program. And until then, take good care of yourself and stock up on those lime sips, just in case.